Wesleyan, so he has seen this country from a number of different points of view. This is his fifth book, but his first foray into C.S. Lewis studies. So he's going to be talking about C.S. Lewis, or America Discovers C.S. Lewis. Could you hand me that? So here it is, and I believe these are already signed.
It says signed by the author.
Yeah, it says signed by the author. So the way it works, the signature is no added, but if you say, thanks for your help on this book, that's $5 more. And if you say, I'm sorry, I stole all your ideas for this book, that's $25, right? It's a graded scale. So let's let's have Dr. Snyder take over and tell us a bit about American responses to C.S. Lewis. And I'm sure something will come up about American responses versus British responses, which you do cover. So let me have you come up front, and we'll start the program.
All right. Thank you. I flew in today from Florida. Did anybody ever tell you it's cold here? Of course, I'm kind of used to that myself. I grew up in Indiana, and you mentioned Indiana Wesleyan University, where I taught for 5 years. And I remember the last time I was there, the last year I was there, it was 1 week, it was minus 30 every day, and then I left. But that's not why. Okay, so anyway, I'm used to it. I can handle the cold. All right, no problem with that. Of course, this probably doesn't seem cold to you, does it? No, of course not. But when you're in Florida for 12 years, that's what happens to you. I vowed when I moved to Florida that would not happen, because everybody else was walking around talking about how cold it was when it was 70 degrees. And now I put on a coat when it's 70 degrees because it just feels so cold. Just amazing how that works. It's good to be back at the Wade Center because this is where it all started. Okay? 4 years ago is when I did some initial research on C.S. Lewis. I'd always wanted to, but I thought, how do you do that if you're a professor of American history? How are you going to make C.S. Lewis fit into that? So I was looking for some kind of a niche. Let me just give you 2 letters that Lewis wrote to Americans. On the auspicious day of the 27th of March, 1951, where he said, and the first letter was to Vera Matthews of Beverly Hills. He knew lots of people in America by correspondence, and some of these were very regular correspondence. In her last letter, she had informed Lewis of the death of her father. Now, he offered sympathy, of course, but he also seemed to have caught a whiff of an illusion in her comments. He was direct and sympathetic simultaneously. He noted that she had to be careful, not to act as if it hadn't happened. It matters when people close to us die, he counseled, and he hoped that she would not pretend otherwise. Okay. Another letter went to a rather famous surgeon by the name of Warfield Fear. That's very hard to say sometimes. And Warfield Fear at the Johns Hopkins is where he actually taught and also did surgery. He commented, Lewis in this letter, on the death of Janie King Moore, who most of you probably know was the lady he took care of forever and ever, it seemed like, in his life until she finally died in 1951, earlier that year. Lewis's comments on her death to Fear in the letter of the 27th seemed to indicate he was relieved of a great burden. Lewis went about his routine the rest of the day, unaware that in a small town in northern Indiana, a place he never even would have known existed, a child was born on that same 27th of March, 1951. That in itself is not an essential part of the C.S. Lewis story. But since I was that child, it has some importance for me. All right? So it's kind of interesting to go back to that date and look and see who Lewis was writing to on the very day that I was born. How was I introduced to Lewis? When was I introduced? I do not remember. That's really kind of sad. I wish I did remember exactly. As a matter of fact, in the dedication to my book, I said, this book is dedicated to someone I don't remember. That person who first either mentioned the name C.S. Lewis to me or who first recommended one of his books. Although I don't remember you, God does. And I hope we shall meet again when we dwell in his presence. All right? That was the best dedication I could think of at this point. I was a voracious reader as a child. The library didn't hold enough books for me. Yet somehow, I never found a C.S. Lewis book. Nobody ever told me about C.S. Lewis. Even though, I mean, we're talking about the 1950s and into the early 1960s, and all the Narnia books were written at that point. I can't believe I didn't find one of those, because I loved science fiction. I can't believe I didn't find his space trilogy during that time period. I would have just dug into that with no problem whatsoever. But somewhere along the way, I read some C.S. Lewis, and I can't even tell you the first book I read. I'm just not sure which one it was. Might have been Screwtape Letters. I mean, maybe it was the start of the space trilogy. Again, I really can't pinpoint it. But I do know that I had read The Great Divorce by the time I was getting ready to graduate from college, because I was a radio, TV, film major at the time. And for my final project, for my TV production that I did a takeoff on The Great Divorce. And what I did was I had 2 spotlights, and I had one spotlight on a person over here, another spotlight over there, and I did the conversation with the Episcopal ghost. Okay, if you're familiar with that in The Great Divorce, and had that going back and forth, and that was at Purdue University. And so, yeah, I knew that famous Christian school in Indiana. But I was hoping that that would, be a good witness to my fellow students. So I know I was very much into C.S. Lewis by the time I was in college and by the time I got out of college. I read him constantly throughout my life. In fact, I've gone back lately and I've looked at the book, the big book I have. It combines Pilgrim's Regress, Christian Reflections essays, and God in the Dock essays. And as I go through all those essays, I notice they're all marked up. And I said, I guess I did that. But I can't remember having read all of those. So I think what's happened is C.S. Lewis kind of worked his way into my psyche along the way, and I never lost the desire to somehow, someday, do something with C.S. Lewis. Right? But like I said, I'm an American historian. I teach American history, so how do you do it? It was in 2013 that I was on a cruise in the Caribbean. Please don't get envious. And I was reading Alistair McGrath's biography of Lewis, and I got to the last chapter, and he made just one sentence stuck out in my mind. He said, Lewis has always been appreciated more in the United States than in England. And then he did a little bit of an analysis of it, but not too much. And then I began to wonder, has anybody ever written a book about Lewis and Americans? If America really received him better than his native country, that should be a focus for somebody. Okay? And then the next year, in 2014, I was granted a sabbatical. And that talk about a blessing, that was. I had a full year where I could just do research. Now, the first thing on my mind in that research was a project with a colleague of mine in the religion department at Southeastern University. We were going to work together on spiritual advisors to presidents. And so I was going to do the research and he was going to do the writing. And I went to 6 presidential libraries during that sabbatical year and dug out all kinds of things. Now, if you haven't seen the book yet, that's because it hasn't been written. And we're actually having a hard time finding a publisher that actually wants to write this, wants to publish this book. Isn't that fascinating? Yeah, sounds good to me. But anyway, while I was doing that, I said, where do I start on my research? How about at the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton? Since he was a spiritual advisor to so many presidents, that'll give me all kinds of clues what I want to look at in the presidential library. So I came here to do research on Billy Graham and his relationship to presidents, but I said, I just know right down the street is something called the Wade Center. This is my chance. Okay? I'd never been to Wheaton before. I knew about the Wade Center, but I had never been here. And so I said, I'm going to take a few days, and I'm just going to do a little bit of looking and find out if there's a niche here in any way. I want to know, has anybody written a treatise, that's more than just an article here, an article there, that tries to be more kind of comprehensive with respect to how Lewis interacted with Americans. And after a couple of days of research here with some very good people helping me, I came away believing that there was a gap, that there was something that needed to be said about this. And so I spent the rest of my sabbatical year, when I wasn't going to presidential libraries, sitting in my nice easy chair at home, I love sabbaticals, and reading every letter that C.S. Lewis ever wrote to an American. I wanted to get the feel for how he interacted with Americans. There were actually two things that I wanted to accomplish. One was Lewis's attitude toward Americans. I wanted to know how he viewed them. And of course that ends up changing over his life. He did actually start out rather prejudiced toward Americans. For instance, when he writes to Arthur Greaves, one of his best friends for his entire life, he indicates to Greaves, back when just before he's 18 years old, that he's beginning to read some American authors. And he singles out Nathaniel Hawthorne, whom he admires. Yet he thought it a shame that someone of Hawthorne's genius had to be an American. Okay, it was such a shame for that. Okay, and then when Lewis returned to Oxford after the war to resume his studies, he commented on the increasing number of Americans on campus, and he called it an invasion. And then he related a story to his father in one of his letters about a professor who read a paper at a literary meeting who acknowledged his effort wasn't all that good. So he thought he needed to apologize for even offering it. He had meant to publish it, he told the group, but he felt it was so bad that he sent it to an American magazine instead. Lewis found that appropriately amusing. So there was an attitude, you might say, at the beginning with Lewis. But coming here and going to study Billy Graham, I thought I'll put Lewis here and I'll put Billy Graham over there, and there's Wheaton for you right there. Okay, because they did meet in 1955 when Billy Graham went and did a crusade in England, and Lewis, of course, was at Cambridge at that time, and they sat down and they talked together, and Lewis did make a comment about Billy Graham at that point. And he said the following. He said, "I had the pleasure of meeting Billy Graham once. We had dinner together during his visit to Cambridge University in 1955 while he was conducting a mission to students. I thought he was a very modest and very sensible man, and I liked him very much indeed." So I just thought you might like to know that went very well between those two. And since you have both of those on campus here, that's good that it works out that way. So that, his attitude toward Americans, but also his influence on Americans over time, when Americans suddenly realized there was somebody worth reading. So I did, when I was here at the Wade, I set myself up, and that was the official Snyder research station, in case you're wondering. By the way, coming here in August, that's a great time to come, because I had the room all to myself. That was wonderful. I hope that isn't the case in the future. I hope you always have somebody who's going to be researching in August. But that was kind of fun to be able to do that. It isn't until the Screwtape Letters gets published in America that Americans really start taking notice of C.S. Lewis. Now, he has a few contacts before then, and there are a few academics who have written to him and appreciate some things that he has written, but it's the Screwtape Letters that really makes it all kind of take off at this point. And so that's when his renown does spread to America. One of the first early letters he got from an American group, actually this group was called the Society for the Prevention of Progress. Okay. And the letter was an invitation for Lewis to become a member, asking him to send his credentials so they might determine if he would be qualified for membership. In the same, obviously this is a kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, okay? In the same kind of spirit as the original letter, he responded that he felt he probably was a member of any society so named just by the fact of his birth. He hoped that his unremitting practice of reaction, obstruction, and stagnation, and his abolition of man would suffice to make him a member in good standing. All right? Okay, I loved that particular letter. Okay. And the first individual that American that Lewis really became very familiar with and became friends with was a professor from Beloit College in Wisconsin, and his name was Chad Walsh. Okay. Chad Walsh grew up in Virginia in a very Bible-centered, Bible-oriented town, and he rejected it all. They were a little bit heavy-handed in the way, and when they realized that he had doubts about things, they tried to really make him a Christian. And finally, he was able to escape, is pretty much the way he put it. He went to the University of Virginia, where he didn't have to worry about being told he needed to be a Christian. And he didn't have people shoving religion at him at the University of Virginia. He was free, he felt. But the freedom did not settle the bigger questions that now began to crowd upon his mind. Okay? We still think about these things even when we say we're not. Okay? While he claimed to be a self-satisfied atheist, doubts crept in. Is there such a thing as good or evil? He often wondered. Is there any meaning in life and the universe? Would events in the 1930s, world events rather, in the 1930s help crystallize the answers for him? He's trying to figure this out. Now, he's a good atheist. He has a lot of good atheist friends. And when Hitler takes over in Germany, he's troubled. And he goes to his atheist friends, and he wants to know what they think about this. And Walsh says they agreed with me that the world was a senseless jungle. Very well, they reasoned, if the world is a jungle, it's absurd to speak of right and wrong. Everything is relative. Hitler thinks he's doing right to invade Poland and murder the Jews. Very well, it is right for him. It's all in the way you look at it. That was the response from his friends. Right? And that kind of shook him. And he knew he had to come to grips with this concept of evil, that there really was something like this. And he said, I began to see that concepts of good and evil are deeply ingrained in each of us. If we throw them out the window, they sneak in through the back door. And the state of the world at that time made it more and more difficult to believe that education and science would rather easily bring about a utopia in which people would be nice to each other because there was nothing to quarrel about. I began dimly to perceive the cruel and irrational depths of human nature. I was not yet ready to see such unsightly depths in myself, but I could see them in Hitler and his kind. Right? Well, that's a good place to start. Okay, but then it kind of needs to come home after that. And then he begins reading some people like, C.S. Lewis. Right? And a friend actually sends him a book you might have heard of called Peril Andr. Okay? And here's what he said about this. Okay? I quickly consumed it from cover to cover. I was struck, first of all, by the sheer beauty of the book. It transported me into a kind of Elysian fields, or better yet, an unspoiled Eden, inhabited by the innocent and unfallen. A second revelation was that even though he had always been a science fiction fan, he had never read any science fiction like this, where it could be used as a vehicle of great philosophic and psychological myth. The third revelation, though, was the greatest of all. Finally, he said, and most importantly, in Peril Andr, I found my imagination being baptized. I love that wording, okay? My imagination being baptized. At the time, I was slowly thinking, feeling, fumbling my way towards the Christian faith, and had reached the point where I was more than half convinced that it was true. This conviction, however, was a thing more of the mind than of the imagination and heart. In Peril Andr, I got the taste and smell of Christian truth. Notice it's not just all up here. Right? It has to encompass the entire being. Right? He says, my senses as well as my soul were baptized. It was as though an intellectual abstraction or speculation had become flesh and dwelt in its solid bodily glory among us. All from reading Peril Andr. Okay? Later, when he writes about the influence of Lewis on Americans as a whole, okay, he wrote an essay called Impact on America about C.S. Lewis, and he said this: the combination of urbanity, wit, this has to do with Screwtape Letters now, the combination of urbanity, wit, imagination, and uncompromising orthodoxy caught the imagination of many reviewers and a large reading public. It had been a long time since this combination of passionate faith and wit had been available, and it contrasted mightily with the dull or heavily strident works of most religious writers. A certain snob quality may have entered into the appeal of the Screwtape Letters. Here at last was a religious book, indeed a specifically Christian book, written with such sophistication and elegance that one need not apologize for leaving it out on the coffee table. What a way to describe, the effect of the Screwtape Letters. Okay? Now, what happens is that Chad Walsh writes the very first book analyzing C.S. Lewis. So we have an American in the forefront now writing about this man when nobody else has really started to do so. And the book comes out in the late 40s, and it's called C.S. Lewis, Apostle to the Skeptics. And you don't just write a book about someone like Lewis at this point without talking to Lewis yourself. So he came over to England, and he did have an appointment with Lewis, and he sat down with him. It's kind of interesting how his first impressions, he said, he greeted me warmly. He looks much like his pictures, a little more slender than I had imagined, a wrinkled gray suit, brown tie messily tied, scruffed black shoes. Everybody talks about this with Lewis. It wasn't the snappiest dresser, apparently, okay? We chatted a while. Then in about an hour's time, I got most of the info I need from him. He was very cooperative as well as marvelous entertaining. He said, I think you did a good job of those 3 chapters you sent me, but what are you going to write about in the other 17? Lewis was always like that. He didn't want people writing about him until he was dead. He said, a living author, you shouldn't write about a living author. Right? But he gave him permission. He worked with him regardless. Further reflections on Lewis's character and manner are found in Walsh's book here in chapter 2 called The Man. And before meeting Lewis for the first time, Walsh couldn't figure out why the pictures of him on the book Dust Jackets, sad-eyed, world-weary, didn't seem to match the wit and the grace that he experienced in the books. He says, only after I met Lewis did I see the solution to the enigma was simpler than the theories I had been devising. He consented to pose for a couple of snapshots, and I perceived that, like half of humanity, he stands stiffly at attention and freezes into impersonality when a camera is pointed his way. The picture on the dust jackets resembles him about as much as a mummy resembles a living man. I wish I could have seen C.S. Lewis. I wish we had some kind of video of C.S. Lewis, but we have none. David and I were talking about that just before this started. And if you ever come across one, let David know, okay? Want that at the Wade Center, right? Okay. He said, Walsh was most taken by what he called the aliveness of his face, both when he was talking and when he was listening. His quick smile, Walsh noted, could have been called sweet except for the feminine connotation of that word. It did not ring true for Lewis, who was, quote, one of the most masculine persons I have ever known. It became obvious to the interviewer, Walsh, that his subject had very little regard for making carefully guarded statements. Nowadays, it's always, this is, don't quote me on this, Concern for public relations was not part of his internal makeup. I never detected him pausing to phrase a reply carefully for fear it might be used against him. If I mentioned prominent names, he commented on them with matter-of-fact candor, whether favorably or no, and did not add that this was, quote, off the record. Neither did Lewis try to paint himself as an expert on every subject. Walsh witnessed genuine humility. When I inquired his opinions on a vast variety of matters, he answered with equal directness, though sometimes his response was simply, I don't know enough to have an opinion. End of discussion. Next. Okay. Walsh's conclusion, it adds up to plain unself-consciousness. To the world outside of Oxford, he is a famous figure. To himself, he is an Oxford Don who writes an occasional book in odd moments. Mostly what he does is being an Oxford Don. Okay? And the books just kind of come after that. I don't need to go into great length with this particular person. I think you all know Joy Davidman Gresham Lewis at various stages of her life. Okay? But the reason that she first became connected with Lewis, obviously years before they got married, was through Chad Walsh. He's the one who said, go ahead, write to him. You've been reading his stuff, write to him. He responds. Okay? So she did. Okay? And she wrote to Walsh at one point. She said, we more than share your feeling for Lewis, talking about her and her husband at the time. With us, it was not the last step, but the first that came from reading his books. For we were raised atheists and took the truth of atheism for granted. And like most Marxists, we're so busy acting that we never stopped to think. If I hadn't picked up The Great Divorce one day, I suppose I'd still be running madly around with leaflets, showing as much intelligent purpose as a headless chicken. Right? So she credits Lewis for getting her straightened out in her thinking. Right? And she would not always agree with him. I mean, she would write letters to him, and they might disagree on a certain topic, but she didn't mind it. And by the way, Lewis didn't mind that either. He liked the give and take like this, which is one of the reasons he liked her so much, because she would say whatever was on her mind, and he would respond back. Again, she's writing, in this case, her testimony is in this book right here, These Found the Way. It is a very, very interesting testimony if you haven't had a chance to read that yet. I would definitely encourage that. She's writing to Walsh again, and she says, Lord, he knocked my props out from under me unerringly. One shot to a pigeon. I haven't a scrap of my case left. And what's more, I've seldom enjoyed anything more. I don't enjoy that, do you? I don't like to have things knocked out from under me like that, all right? Being disposed of so neatly by a master of debate, all fair and square, it seems to be one of the great pleasures of life. Though I'd never have suspected it in my arrogant youth, I suppose it's unfair tricks of argument that leave wounds. But after the sort of thing that Lewis does, what I feel is a craftsman's joy at the sight of a superior performance. Wow. You know, you don't have to be right all the time. Okay? When, after Joy died, they had been married for 3 years, Lewis wrote to Walsh about her death, and he said, 2 of the last things she said were, quote, you have made me happy, and I am at peace with God. Okay? Nice to see things like that. Okay? Those are key Americans. How many have read this book? A Severe Mercy? I highly recommend it. Sheldon Van Hawken and his wife, whom he called Davy, came over to Oxford. He went over to study. She was with him. And they're both atheists at the time. And they both start reading C.S. Lewis. Okay? Now, Lewis is in Oxford, okay, but they haven't met him, but they're reading his books. And I think she started with Screwtape Letters, and he started with the Space Trilogy. And both were just enraptured by what they read. In fact, his wife becomes a Christian before he does. And then he writes letters to Lewis. Now, here he is in Oxford. Lewis is in Oxford. Why don't you just go talk to him? You ever heard of letters? We used to do things like that. Okay? We used to write letters to people. And so he wrote letters to Lewis, and Lewis answered him back, and with some really strong things. And they became very fast friends. Sheldon Van Hawken becomes a Christian also at this time. And then Sheldon Van Hawken and his wife go back to America, where he becomes a professor in Virginia. And shortly afterwards, she contracts a terminal disease. And she dies within 6 months, I think, of getting that disease. And Sheldon Van Hawken is devastated. So he writes letters to Lewis, and Lewis writes back. Okay? And Van Hawken keeps wanting to hang on. He doesn't want to let go. And Lewis has to be quite straight with him. Okay? He says, one way or another, the thing had to die, he said. Perpetual springtime is not allowed. You were not cutting the wood of life according to the grain. You have been treated with a severe mercy. Okay? You have been brought to see that you were jealous of God. And from us, you have been led back to us and God. It remains to go on to God and us. Okay? Because he was hanging on so much to the relationship that he had. Okay? After that letter, now, you know, you get a letter like that, some people might say, well, that's enough of you. I'm going to go ahead and keep my self-pity party. You know, that's not the way that Van Hawken responded. He said, it was a very deep friendship on my part. He said how he felt after this letter. No man ever did so much to shape my mind, quite aside from Christianity, which of course shaped my whole life. I have never loved a man more. And I must believe from things he said and wrote to me that he felt both friendship and affection for me. After this severe and splendid letter, I loved Lewis like a brother and father combined. Okay. Strong relationship there. I don't know, have you ever heard of this guy? Okay. The Collector. Again, as we were talking beforehand, he said Clyde Kilby came along at just the right time when things didn't cost so much to collect. And so the Wade Center really had a lot that came into it as a result of what he did here. Okay. What's interesting to me is that there's somebody I've never met, but I'm Facebook friends with. I have so many friends. I have 1,200 of my closest friends on Facebook. But this person responds a lot to things that I write on Facebook. And when I told, I said I was writing this book and so forth, and she had been a student here at Wheaton, and she had had Clyde Kilby as her professor. And she sent me notes that she took in his class over the book Till We Have Faces. Okay. You know what I'm discovering? There are just Lewis people everywhere out there. And I love this fellowship of Lewis people, is really what I'm finding. Okay? And I want to get to know more and more of these people. When Clyde Kilby goes over to Oxford in 1954, I believe it was, he goes to meet Lewis. Interesting thing, 1953, okay? He is with, his wife was with him. Kilby's wife accompanied him. He asked at the college gate whether there was anything to the report that Mr. Lewis disliked women. Whoever he spoke with made it seem that there was some truth in the report. So his wife went shopping instead, and he met Lewis by himself. Okay, false reports. Upon knocking, Kilby was greeted warmly by the man who had meant so much to him in writing. First impressions, he has a pleasant, almost jolly face, full though not fat, with a double chin. He has a high forehead and thinning hair. Actually, he is a much better looking man than the published picture of him. In fact, Walsh said that, and Kilby says that too. He spoke of the making of a bibliography as just plain labor and laughed about the idea of the scholar's life as a sedentary one, saying that the physical labor of pulling big folios from the shelves of the Bodleian was all the exercise he needed. Okay. And then he wanted to know if Lewis was going to be lecturing while he was in Oxford. And Lewis said he had no lecture scheduled. He bantered me as a college professor wanting to hear a lecture while on vacation. In fact, in all his talk, Kilby said, there is an incipient good humor and genuineness that makes a conversation with him a real pleasure. The only awkward moment was when Kilby asked him to autograph one of Lewis's books he had brought with him. Although Lewis agreed to the request, he commented that he saw no sense in doing so. That led Kilby to conclude something about his character. He said, both from reading his books and talking with him, I get the impression he's far more fearful than most of us of the subtle sin of pride, and tries in every way to escape it. Thus his reticence to give an autograph. Okay. Moving along in American history, I know you probably know this guy too, most of you, and Lewis's impact on a guy named Charles Colson. Okay. Charles Colson was in the Nixon White House. Charles Colson went to prison. Okay. Not because he taped anything, but there were other charges that were brought during this time. Charles Colson was a very, very proud man. He kind of liked being in the White House, as you can see him sitting there across the desk from Nixon in this particular photograph. He liked the fact that he and Nixon were close and they could talk. But of course, when Watergate hit, a lot of people got pulled into what was happening with Watergate. Okay? And Colson, at this point, really realizing he might go to prison, is rethinking his entire life and wanting some answers about life. And he goes to visit a friend. His name is Tom Phillips, the president of Raytheon Corporation, and he had told Colson he'd given his life to Christ. Okay? Colson just wanted to talk to him. So what does Tom Phillips do when Colson goes to his house to talk to him? He pulls out a book called Mere Christianity. And he begins to read Lewis's description of pride, that very, very famous chapter in there, which he said was at the foundation of all other sins. He called it an anti-God state of mind. That hit Colson where it hurt the most. He had been proud all his life of his achievements. Now Lewis was telling him it was his chief problem. Okay? That's why you are where you are now. It's your pride that has led you here. Okay? As he read, this is Colson now, as he read, I could feel a flush coming into my face, a curious burning sensation that made the night seem even warmer. Lewis's words seemed to pound straight at me. Phillips kept reading aloud, coming to the place where Lewis noted that pride always looks down on people, and that if you are always looking down, you are blind to what may exist above you. Suddenly, I felt naked and unclean, my bravado defenses gone, Colson lamented. I was exposed, unprotected, for Lewis's words were describing me. As he continued, one passage in particular seemed to sum up what had happened to all of us at the White House. For pride is spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense. Right. Charles Colson has a very dramatic conversion experience. It doesn't spare him from going to prison, but in prison, he actually leads somebody else from the White House to the Lord, who's in the same prison with him. And he starts to realize what it's like for prisoners. And so when he gets out of prison, he decides he's going to devote his life to something, like that. His book is called Born Again. I remember when this first came out. I read it immediately. I was very impressed with the Born Again book. And then he starts Prison Fellowship, okay, which is now a worldwide organization in which they minister in the prisons. And Chuck Colson, I was actually just living right down the street from Prison Fellowship for a while when I was living in Northern Virginia. It's been a wonderful ministry. If you ever have anything called Angel Tree in your church, okay, that's Prison Fellowship that's doing that, okay? Connecting prisoners with their children. Chuck Colson died, I think, about 2012. Okay? But if you ever read anything by Chuck Colson, what you will find is he's always quoting one guy. He's always quoting C.S. Lewis because he meant so much to him. Turned his whole life around. Okay? Now, those are some maybe famous people. Okay? How about some people we don't know quite as much? I mentioned this guy at the beginning when Lewis wrote a letter to him. Warfield Fear, the surgeon at Johns Hopkins, after the war, after World War II, he would, a lot of people were sending Lewis things because rationing was still going on in Britain. And they were really low on lots of things, and Americans were just sending all kinds of stuff over to Lewis. Fear always sent hams. And Lewis loved them. And Lewis loved sharing them. And so what he did a couple of times is that he took the ham to the Inklings meeting. And they would scrounge up whatever else they could find to go with this beautiful ham that had arrived. And they finally, at one point, they decided, we're going to let this guy know how much we appreciate it. And so they sent him what was called the ham testimonial, where it says, the undersigned, having just partaken of your ham, have drunk your health. Okay, and then we have a list of a few people you might know, like C.S. Lewis, Christopher Reuel Tolkien, okay, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien down at the bottom there, and a few other people, the Inklings, who were there that particular night. So that's quite a thing to have on your wall, if you did. And then there are other people who are even less well known, but Lewis kept up a very regular correspondence with them. You might say, Lewis would always complain, I got to write all these letters. But he said, but if I've written something that means something to people and they have questions, can I just not respond? I have to. It's an obligation. And you would never get the sense of obligation from the letters themselves, because he always gets past the obligation angle. And when he's writing it because he knows these people need to hear from him. Okay? There was a woman by the name of Vera Matthews. She got married. Her name was changed to Vera Gebert. Then she got divorced, but she kept the last name. She wrote to Lewis from the mid-1940s all the way to the end of his life. Okay. They corresponded regularly. Okay. She would send him all kinds of things too. So he wrote back one time, "The customs people will begin to suspect that what you are really doing is to run a black market shop in Oxford with me as your distributing agent." Okay. She says at one point, I'm thinking about maybe coming to live in England. Lewis wrote back, "Try living in free England for a bit, and you would realize what government interference can mean. And not only interference, but interference in a schoolmarm form which is maddening." Then he added this, "There are times when one feels that a minister or two dangling from a lamppost in Whitehall would be an attraction that would draw a hard-worked man up to London." Okay. He had some very definite views, okay, about some of the politics going on during this time period. What really was fascinating to me, and I talk about missed opportunities, although it may not have worked out because of her advanced age. She was still alive when I was doing the research. And I didn't find out until 2 months after she died. Then I got this picture actually from an obituary that I found, because I was looking her up. I was just trying to find information about these various people that Lewis wrote to. And I said, "She died in December?" She was alive when I was doing all this research? I wonder if her mind was well enough that I could have interviewed her. Okay, missed opportunities. All right. I'll ask her someday in heaven. Okay. All right. Who else did he write to a lot? There was a mother and a son, Belle Allen and her son Edward, who lived in Westfield, Massachusetts. And Edward actually sent him a suit. He gave it to Warney. And Warney loved that suit. Right? By the way, Lewis gave away a lot of things. At one point, he basically said, I know someone who needs this more. I hope you don't mind if I give it to somebody who really needs it. And another time during Lent, I think it was, he said, I need to give this to my good Catholic friend, Mr. Tolkien. Okay. Okay. And so he never hung on to everything that he got. He was always wanting to share. As post-war rationing was finally beginning to disappear under the new conservative government in the 1950s, Lewis was happy to report to Allen, the Edward Allen, that tea was no longer going to be rationed. He added that the government was also now allowing pork to be put back in sausages. I thought that's what they were. Okay. That last comment may sound a little comical. Lewis agreed, as he followed up by jesting, "This, I should think, will probably turn the younger generation into lifelong dyspeptics, for it has grown up to think of a sausage as an ounce of soya bean flour fried in a skin." He also commented to Belle, the mother, because she was trying to read Pilgrim's Regress, and she said, "I can't figure it out." And Lewis said, "Then drop it." I'm paraphrasing. He said, "I originally wrote that thinking it would just be for a scholarly audience, and I can understand if you've got problems with it, and if you do, just leave it alone. Don't bother with it." How many authors have you ever heard saying, "Don't bother with what I've written"? Okay, most authors don't say something like that. Right? There was a woman who lived variously, at New York, North Carolina. The thing is, we've tried to find her. I know here at the Wade Center, Mary Van Dusen. Have we ever found her? No. Okay, I didn't think so. Trying to discover, who she was and any information about her. But she's one of his, correspondents that wrote to him right up to almost the last week of his life. Okay? He wrote a letter back to her at that point. Her letters from the start seemed to be a relief to Lewis, inundated as he was with some of other rather needy individuals. We'll get to one of those in a minute. He provided Van Dusen with quite personal details of the struggles he had endured trying to placate Mrs. Janie Moore. He even noted that Chad Walsh, despite their friendship, knew little of his private life, yet he was willing to share with her what it had been like in the Lewis household. for so many years. It was a place rarely, quote, at peace for 24 hours due to, quote, senseless wranglings, lyings, backbitings, follies, and scares. I never went home without a feeling of terror as to what appalling situation might have developed in my absence. And yet we have some people who think he lived in an ivory tower. Didn't know anything about real life. Okay, Lewis knew about real life. Right? They talked quite a bit about a lot of things. They talked about government sometimes. He wrote this back to her once. He said, if we go along with the concept of government by majority vote, what is the recourse if the majority establishes something wrong? For instance, if the communists in this country can persuade the majority to sell into Russia, or even to set up devil worship and human sacrifice, what is the democratic reply? When we said government by the people, did we only mean as long as we don't disagree with the people too much? But of one thing he was certain, if the government were to require Christians to obey laws that were directly opposed to the faith, they would, quote, have to disobey and be martyred. Perhaps pure democracy is really a false ideal. This was someone that he enjoyed writing to because she was intelligent, had good letters back and forth with her. Okay? And most people know this person because one of the first books that came out, the first book that came out about Lewis's letters that he wrote to Americans was one called Letters to an American Lady. Only this, at that time, they were not free to give the name of the American lady. We now know it was Mary Willis Shelburne, and she was somebody who had actually written a book herself of poems. Call her his most consistent and problematic American correspondent. It seemed like she always had a problem. And she was always on the verge of total financial ruin. And you know what he did? Out of his royalties, he sent her a monthly check to try to help her out with her finances. And you might think if somebody is almost a perpetual whiner about things, that Lewis would say, okay, enough is enough. But he didn't. He kept writing to her right up to the very end. Okay? He said, what on earth is the trouble about there being a rumor of my death, he wrote to her one time. There's nothing discreditable in dying. I've known the most respectable people do it. Okay? He liked to talk about their common physical distresses at a certain point. He kept his sense of humor even as he suffered greater physical distress, because he's going through things about 1961, 62 when he's writing to her here. Telling her with respect to their bodies, okay, like old automobiles, aren't they? Where all sorts of apparently different things keep going wrong. But what they add up to is the plain fact that the machine is wearing out. Well, it was not meant to last forever. Still, I have a kindly feeling for the old rattletrap. A couple of other key ones as well. As we grow older, we become like old cars. More and more repairs and replacements are necessary. We must just look forward to the fine new machine's latest resurrection model, which are waiting for us, we hope, in the divine garage. Okay. And as she's thinking about death, he's trying to get through to her, get a different perspective on this. And he said this once. He said, pain is terrible, but surely you need not have fear as well. Can you not see death as the friend and deliverer? It means stripping off that body which is tormenting you, like taking off a hair shirt or getting out of a dungeon. What is there to be afraid of? You have long attempted, and none of us does more, a Christian life. Your sins are confessed and absolved. Has this world been so kind to you that you should leave it with regret? There are better things ahead than any we leave behind. Okay? And trying to get her to acknowledge that was something he was always trying to do. Okay? And of course, he wrote letters to children, and we have those published as well, I know. So I'm not going to rehash everything, but a lot of people will quote that letter that he wrote to the mother of Lawrence. Her name was Philinda Craig. And Lawrence was very concerned because he seemed to like Aslan more than Jesus. And of course, Lewis wrote back to the mother and said this, look, if I were Lawrence, I'd just say in my prayers something like this. Dear God, if the things I've been thinking and feeling about those books are things you don't like and are bad for me, please take away those feelings and thoughts. But if they are not bad, then please stop me from worrying about them. But and I've seen a lot of quotes out of that letter. One of them, obviously, even before this, says you can't like Aslan more than Jesus, because what Aslan does is what Jesus does. Okay, but I haven't seen too many people quote the last part here. But it would be kind and Christian-like if he then added, "And if Mr. Lewis has worried any other children by his books or done them any harm, then please forgive him and help him never to do it again." And he wrote to a girl by the name of Joan Lancaster also. Joan Lancaster lived in Sarasota, Florida. And she was quite talented, I believe. Very artistic child. She was in love with opera, playing the cello, wanting to write, and Lewis gave her directions on writing. Things like always prefer the plain direct word to the long vague one. Don't implement promises, keep them. All right. Never use abstract nouns when concrete ones will do. If you mean most people died, don't say mortality rose. Okay. Don't use words too big for the subject. Don't say infinitely when you mean very. Otherwise, you'll have no word left when you want to talk about something really infinite. Okay. And at the end, the very last letter exchange in Lewis's final September was short, somewhat melancholy, saying merely, "Your letter is full of things that I'd like to reply to properly, but I'm not up to it. Last July, I was thought to be dying. I am now an invalid. My brother is away and I have to cope with all the mail. Forgive me." One would expect C.S. Lewis to ask forgiveness for not being able to write more, but he had no need to ask. For at least 18 years, he had devoted himself to the labor of communicating God's truths to all who sought him out. So many of those seekers were Americans, and he never turned any of them away. Okay. In the book, I also talk about a few societies you might be familiar with, like the New York C.S. Lewis Society, the first one that was set up. That was the first one that asked me to come talk about my book, so I really appreciate them. I had never been in New York City before. That was my first time. Right? I may never go back. I don't know, not if I have to drive. I'm not going. Okay, no way. Yeah. And of course, we had just this last June, right? Does this room look familiar? Okay. And of course, the C.S. Lewis Institute, just all over the place. So I got a chapter dealing with these different societies. There are some key people who were here in June. Perhaps you know Jerry Root, perhaps you know William O'Flaherty. There's another guy next to him, perhaps you know at this point. Okay, so I love the C.S. Lewis Institute as well. My first real contact was going to the C.S. Lewis Foundation and going to their academic roundtable and being able to deliver academic papers and kind of critique each other. A very, very enjoyable experience doing that. And of course, the fact that they now own the kilns, and so they're hoping that will be kept up very nicely. And up in Massachusetts, they got this house, and they're trying to turn that into an American Kiln Study Center. Okay. I've been able to visit there as well. Okay. And you might have noticed I left somebody out so far. Walter Hooper, in his lifelong service to Lewis, cannot leave him out. And of course, he becomes the executor of the Lewis Literary Estate. I mean, that has consumed all the rest of his life. And if it hadn't been for Walter Hooper, I could not have sat in my study, in my nice, easy chair, and read all of C.S. Lewis's letters, because he put them out in 3 massive volumes. Right? There are certain times in your life that are like really key moments, like this one right here, where I was able to go over to the kilns and meet Walter Hooper for the first time. He actually communicated with me in helping me with information about this book. And so when I knew we were going to be taking students over, notice how many guys went on this trip. What is it with guys anyway? Okay. So anyway, I wrote to him and I said, "I've got a group coming. Could you come to the kilns and talk to us?" He said, "Be glad to." I mean, just like that. And then when he arrived, I went in to introduce myself and just talk to him. The other professor there and I had talked we're in this tour, and everybody else is in the tour too, and they say, how about if we invite them in on this also? And I went and asked Walter Hooper, is it okay if everybody joins in this? It's here, not just my group? He said, absolutely. And when I went back in and announced to the tour group, if you want to stay and listen to Walter Hooper, you are welcome. There was one college girl who just went, oh, she started fanning herself. Walter Hooper, I can't believe it. I get to sound with him. Now, of course, he would not take it that way. He would think, my goodness, it's just me. That's all. Okay. I think there's a lot of humility in that man. I was finally, you got to put up with this, okay? I was finally made it to Oxford to be able to go to Magdalen College, okay? And of course, I have to take the picture of the kilns that everybody has to take right there. Somebody else took a picture of me when I was standing out in front of the kilns, okay? So that's pretty good too. And if you go up to the top floor next to Lewis's bedroom, you can always sit down at the table and pretend that you're scholarly. Okay. And of course, you always have to go to this place as well, and go to the corner where the Inklings sat. Okay. I hope to go back again. Okay. It's the first time I was able to do that, 2017. There is one more interesting chapter, I think, in my book. Now, I'm looking at the time here. Did we start late? Are we okay?
You have a couple more minutes.
That's what I was afraid of. Okay. I was afraid of that. What I did in Chapter 8, I did my own survey with the help of the Wade Center. I really appreciated that, where word went out. Okay? And what I did was I asked certain questions in that survey in 2014. When and how were you introduced to C.S. Lewis? Which of his writings have had the greatest impact on your thinking and or spiritual development? Are you now, have you ever been involved with the C.S. Lewis Society or organization or with some other activity connected with Lewis? Please explain. Okay. Have you viewed any of the Shadowlands productions? If so, what is your opinion of them? Have you viewed any of the Narnia productions, whether the ones created for television or the 3 Narnia films? If so, what is your opinion of them? I got lots of responses. I'm very pleased with that. And I had then this, other comments? And boy, that got filled. Lots and lots of other comments. And that's the part that I probably should have really focused on here. Okay, sorry about that. But let me just kind of give you a taste of some other comments that people made. Let me just start with this one. When I was an arrogant college student who believed only weak and or stupid people believed in Christ, Lewis showed me beyond question that faith could make sense even to an intellectual. He awakened my spiritual imagination with his fiction and persuaded my reason with his non-fiction. He also gave me a grounding in traditional Christianity that facilitated my later conversion to orthodoxy. Okay. Someone else said, we've all heard the question of what single person, living or dead, we would most like to meet. I can name dozens of intriguing figures I would love to meet, but none so much as Lewis. Another expressed the identical sentiment, but in a different way when she shared this hope. I long to go with others on a walking tour in heaven with Jack, as he used to do with Warnie and others, and have a good, lengthy chat with this man who for years now has seemed like a good, dear friend. Okay. That's how that chapter ends. Anyway, if you want to read the other, I'm sorry, you have to get the book. Got to get the book if you're going to read the rest of it, okay? And then, of course, you have to go to Lewis's grave when you're there. And there was that thing at the top of there's flowers, and then there's something, oh no, is that at the bottom? I think it's underneath the flowers. You can't see it too well because it's white. It was an envelope. And on the envelope it simply said, Jack. Do you know how tempted I was to reach down and, just open that envelope and say, okay, who wrote what? Okay, I left it right there. Didn't touch it. Okay, so it would have been wrong for me to do that, I think. That was a personal communication from someone, all right? Through C.S. Lewis, a multitude of Americans have learned to believe in Christianity because they have seen it come to life in his writings. And by those writings, he has shown them how to see everything through the lens of the Christian faith. That is his legacy. That is what a man who never saw America has given to Americans. An illumined Christianity that lights up all of life. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, we have some time for some questions. Wait till you get the microphone to give the questions so that we make sure we're hearing what Dr. Snyder's responding to.
I think it was interesting that you included those Chronicles of Narnia movies in one of the things that you were surveying about. I didn't like them at all because they were so removed from what Lewis wrote. I was just wondering if that was a kind of the consensus in your comments or not.
Okay, you read the book. No, I'm sorry. Let me tell you. What we have here is people grading them on like a sliding scale, basically. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the best of the three. Starting to get disillusioned with Prince Caspian. And a lot of them didn't like Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Okay? They always commented on the good production quality of the films. Okay? But the concern that maybe it was getting too far away from what Lewis was trying to communicate. Okay? So, I mean, I did have a wide range. Some people loved them all. But there was that theme, I think, going through it. Okay? It wasn't everything people wanted it to be. Okay? Same thing might be said of the Shadowlands. I mean, the one with Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. Deborah Winger did a superb job, I think, in that movie. But like a lot of people said, that Anthony Hopkins had no idea who C.S. Lewis was. There is a BBC production of The Shadowlands with Claire Bloom and Joss Ackland. And I mentioned that in the book, and people who had seen that commented on that too. Matter of fact, I show that when I teach about C.S. Lewis. I show that one, certain aspects out of that film, because it's just so much truer to the real nature of who Lewis was. And I think people who had seen both of these films, the Shadowland films, almost overwhelmingly, yeah, the BBC one. That's the one you should watch. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. Maybe we could chalk this up to a prophet in his own country. But why do you believe that he wasn't more appreciated in the UK than he was here?
Well, of course, he wasn't very appreciated at Oxford at all because he was writing outside of his field. And they said, no, you got to be more academic, and you shouldn't be writing all this Christian stuff. Cambridge, of course, then received him. Okay. I try to deal with that in the last chapter, and I do actually incorporate some other people's ideas first. What does Alistair McGrath think? What does Philip Ryken think? What did Chad Walsh think? He wrote something about this. And then the seminar that was held here a few years back, in which Professor Mark Knoll was part of, who's sitting in the back row back there. Okay, I quote him and a few other people about what they think along that line. And then I added a few more things myself. I think, and I'm just guessing, although America has still more of an evangelical subculture than Britain does. And I think there's far more of an influence in that subculture toward Lewis, because things have gotten pretty dry over in his native country, spiritually. And we can complain about how dry it is in America, but comparatively, I think it's still better here than it is there. And I think that's why he's received more here. That's one of the reasons anyway.
You said that Joy knew Chase. Chad, sorry. What was their relationship? Like, because you kind of just said he introduced her to C.S. Lewis, but what was the connection between them that those conversations were happening?
She had read his book, Apostle to the Skeptics. and wrote to him, and they started a correspondence.
They were personal friends.
They became personal friends as a result of that. Yeah.
We should probably finish the time together so people can go out and buy the book and be able to get a signature from Dr. Snyder. Let's give him a last applause.